Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please like, share and subscribe for more exciting content. Today we'll be looking at the life of Mr. Robert Dawes, who was described by the National Crime Agency, or NCA, as one of the most influential and feared organised criminals in Europe. The 49-year-old hailed from Sutton in Ashfield, Nottinghamshire, and his network was said to span Europe, South America, the Middle East and Asia, which enabled him to orchestrate the movements of huge amounts of Class A drugs and money using corruption, violence and intimidation to exert control, while his associates are suspected of shootings and murders in the UK and abroad. Mr. Dawes was accused of buying large amounts of drugs from Italy's 'Ndrangheta mafia, which is thought to run much of Europe's cocaine trade from Calabria. In short, he was a global big fish who brokered deals with the Italian mafia and the Colombian cartels. His crime group was often accused of drug trafficking and money laundering. Around 80,000 members of his organisation were arrested as a result of the investigation. It was the most significant organised criminal cabal in Europe, with a network that literally spanned the globe. At the centre of all of it was Mr. Dawes, a transnational poly-drug trafficker with contacts in high places and corrupt port officials in his pocket all around the world. That was according to Mr. Rob Hickenbottom, who led the investigation by the UK National Crime Agency into Mr. Dawes. Mastermind Mr. Robert Dawes is a dad of three whose crime-stained tentacles spread across Europe and as far as Dubai. From his days as a young criminal on a Nottingham council estate, he became one of Europe's top 10 most wanted gangsters. He got his first conviction at 11 and was jailed aged 20 and again at age 22 for robbery. Inside prison, Mr. Dawes corrupted officers into drug smuggling and ended up creating a ring that netted £500,000 after his second release from prison in 1997. Still on his mid-20s, Mr. Dawes teamed up with mates who controlled Nottingham's notorious Bestwood estate, and from there he made connections with major league drug mobs in Holland and Spain. By 2001, Mr. Dawes was dispatching 50 to 100 kilograms of drugs every week, as well as arming gangs in Manchester, Liverpool, Nottingham and London. In a bid to escape Nottinghamshire police, Dawes bought a villa in sunny Benalmadena worth £1 million, but still wore tracksuits and trainers. His aliases ranged from Tracky, Frankie, the Derbyman, This One and The Voice. When his brother John was arrested and jailed in 2005, at least £8.5 million was sent to Frankie in Spain. Meanwhile, he was laundering cash across the globe and organising larger shipments of cocaine and heroin, before he was caught by French authorities. Prior to emigrating to Spain, his name has cropped up in investigations from Scotland to London, where he is known to have associated with some of the UK's most notorious crime syndicates, including the London-based Addams family. Investigations were launched in 2007 into Mr. Dawes, and his alleged links to the Italian mafia and South American cartels. He was also being investigated in the Netherlands over a wave of murders there in 2014 and 2015, allegedly aimed at taking control of the cocaine trafficking in several European countries. From his base in Al-Dulisa, Dawes is suspected of importing furniture from China and fruit containers from South America, which he would fill with large quantities of cocaine. His cartel also shipped heroin from Turkey and Afghanistan to Britain. Spanish police said that Dawes mainly used shipping containers to move the drugs, but also leisure boats and commercial flights, such as the Air France flight. Despite the fact that Mr. Dawes had been based overseas for many years, his offending has continued to have an impact on communities in the UK, particularly in Nottingham and the East Midlands. Mr. Dawes was prepared to use extreme levels of violence in order to further his reputation and take retribution against those who crossed him. Members or associates of his criminal group are known to have been involved in intimidation, shootings and murders. By 2007, Mr. Dawes was splitting between Spain and Dubai, where he laundered cash, built a £10 million property portfolio, and spent time with a Chinese mistress. Spanish police eventually charged him, but the case collapsed in 2012. Mr. Dawes began organising yet larger shipments of cocaine and heroin, working in thousands of kilos rather than hundreds. Mr. Dawes' crime syndicate mainly capitalised on corruption in poor South American states, to traffic drugs and flood lucrative markets like Europe and France with Class A drugs. Venezuela is one of the many examples of nations suffering from corruption due to cocaine trafficking routes to Europe. The former Dutch colony of Suriname was long ruled by Desi Bouterse, first as a dictator and then as an elected president. He allegedly had contact with Pablo Escobar and did arms for drugs deals with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, in the 1990s. In 1999, Bouterse was convicted in absentia as the mastermind behind a shipment of cocaine to Netherlands. It is clear that there are links between the state and the underworld in Suriname, mentioned former Surinamese diplomat and political analyst Martin Schalbijk. Since then, cocaine routes to Europe have expanded around the region, and so has the corruption. Ecuador, and especially the port of Guayaquil, is now one of the main dispatch points to Europe. Here, drug trafficking allegations have reached the highest levels of the state. In the previous administration of Rafael Correa, there were narco scandals involving government ministers, presidential allies, and even the president himself. Underworld sources in Ecuador, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described how police, armed forces, judges, prosecutors, public registrars, mayors, governors, and even figures in the national government are all on the payroll of cocaine traffickers. If you're not corrupt, then they will corrupt you, said one, who has first-hand knowledge of drug trafficking in the Colombia border region. Another major dispatch point to Europe to emerge over the last decade is the Dominican Republic, a long-time transit route to the United States and Europe. Once again, the increase in trafficking through the country has deepened already high levels of corruption. In the Dominican Republic, decades of corruption have made politics a partner of drug trafficking, and today, this has reached exorbitant levels. Drug trafficking corrupts politicians beginning at the local level, where sources say candidates for municipal elections are routinely bankrolled by traffickers, and their influence rises to the national level, where former Dominican Republic President Danilo Medina has faced scrutiny over his alleged links to the wife of one of the island's most notorious cocaine traffickers, Cesar Emilio Peralta, alias El Abusador. Factions of the Dominican security forces, meanwhile, have crossed the line from corruption to criminal actors, participating in everything from murder for hire to international drug trafficking, according to Dominican prosecutors. The former director of the country's anti-narcotics police was even convicted of stealing nearly a ton of cocaine. When Mr. Robert Dawes was planning a major cocaine shipment in 2013, he turned to a trafficking network formed from within Venezuela itself, the Cartel of the Suns. The Air France case shined light on perhaps the starkest example of the corrosive power of cocaine trade corruption in Venezuela. The Cartel of the Suns is a loose-knit network of trafficking cells embedded in the upper reaches of the Venezuelan security forces and government. The involvement of Venezuelan security forces in the cocaine trade dates back as far back as the early 1990s. But it was the convergence of Mr. Hugo Chavez coming to power with a boom in trafficking through Venezuela to Europe that would shape the fate of the country. This was a process that did not happen overnight, but gradually. It developed more with the arrival of Mr. Chavez, as he allowed the military to get involved in drug trafficking in exchange for its loyalty. For Mr. Chavez, it was a strategic decision to turn a blind eye to cocaine trafficking. Mr. Chavez's tolerance of cocaine trafficking secured the loyalty of the corrupt security forces leadership, a priority for the president after the 2002 attempted coup against him. It also helped support another ally, the guerrillas in the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which are also known by the acronym FARC. Mr. Chavez supported the FARC out of ideological sympathy and as a bulwark against his geopolitical enemies, Colombia and the United States mainly. And the FARC were heavily involved in the cocaine trade all along the Venezuela-Colombia border. Mr. Chavez could not, or would not, contain the corruption that he had permitted. The Bolivarian National Guard and other branches of Venezuela's military went from allowing trafficking to purchasing, storing, transporting, and selling cocaine, which they sourced directly from the FARC. They sold weapons for drugs, and it was an exchange. Many FARC weapons had the insignias of Venezuelan Bolivarian Republic. By the time Mr. Chavez died in March 2013, the cocaine cancer had fully metastasized, eating away at the legitimacy of his Bolivarian revolution. The cabal of Chavista leaders that replaced him, including numerous military and political leaders, now accused of drug trafficking. Among them is not only Chavez's hand-picked successor, Mr. Nicolas Maduro, but also government ministers, regional governors, and senior security and intelligence officials. It was shortly after Mr. Chavez's death when Robert Dawes dispatched his emissaries to meet with a British national known as Charlie Brown, who was his upstream connection with the Cartel of the Suns network. Together, they made the arrangements for the Air France shipment, which we will look at in greater detail in a bit. Criminals like Mr. Dawes capitalized these dismal situations in these South American and African nations to further their highly lucrative drug trafficking business. They were both welcomed in the nations where the journey of the drug started, like Venezuela, and even in destination countries like France and the UK, where corruption was pretty ubiquitous too. Like the Cartel of the Suns, the story of Mr. Thierry, a top European anti-narcotics official accused of helping to traffic drugs, is an extreme case. But in Europe, as in Latin America, it is still just one of part of a much bigger picture. Corruption in Europe might not be as widespread as in Latin America, but its core elements remain the same: structural and strategically planned. According to Europol, cocaine trafficking related corruption is on the rise. The first European mafias to capitalise on large-scale cocaine trafficking, the Galicians and the Italian mafia, already worked in spaces where they were able to penetrate and corrupt the state. But their participation in the cocaine trade took corruption to new levels. Armed with cocaine money, the Galicians infiltrated government institutions, the legal economy and the politics at an unprecedented level. In Italy, cocaine riches have helped organised crime continue to penetrate the state, even as anti-corruption measures have broken up the old ways of working. In December 2019, Italian military police arrested more than 300 people on suspicion of membership of the 'Ndrangheta, the second biggest mafia bust in Italy's history. Suspects included politicians, lawyers, accountants, a local police chief, and a former member of the Italian parliament, within ex-Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia party. The level of infiltration and control the 'Ndrangheta have is worrying and is going to the next level. We're talking about people who are highly educated, white collar. When organised crime from the Balkans moved to the cocaine trade, the region's already weak and corrupt institutions proved easily corrupted. There have been numerous cases linking Balkan politicians and police to drug trafficking, especially in Serbia. In 2009, the head of the Serbian police, Ivica Dačić, faced corruption accusations after he was twice captured on camera meeting with drug lord Rodo Ejub Radlovic. Dačić was never charged. He managed to survive the scandal, and he is now the Serbian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Nonetheless, in most cases the biggest threat of corruption comes from points where cocaine enters Europe. Here, people on the ground, such as port workers or customs officials, can make the difference between success and a seizure. In the port of Rotterdam, for example, several customs officers have been arrested for participating in drug trafficking, including one officer who earns millions waving through contaminated containers before he was arrested and sentenced to 14 years in prison in 2017. Europe's cocaine corridors are currently evolving and expanding. All of its 20 busiest container ports have seen cocaine seizures of over 100 kilos in the past 3 years. Meanwhile, cocaine routes are opening up all around Latin America, from the ports of the southern cone countries to the mouth of the Amazon River. Wherever these new routes go, the cancer of corruption follows. The future of the cocaine trade may well lie in the hands of these corruption networks, which criminals like Mr. Dawes cleverly utilise for personal gains. Let us look at the Venezuelan organisation, Cartel of the Suns, that fueled the growth of petty thief Mr. Dawes into an international drug kingpin. The Cartel of the Suns, known as Cartel de los Soles in Spanish, was supposedly headed by high-ranking members of the armed forces of Venezuela, who were involved in international drug trading. This phenomenon began when Colombian drugs began to enter Venezuela from corrupt border units, and the rot moved its way up the ranks. Reports that members of the Venezuelan military were involved in drug trafficking began in the 1990s, though it was limited to taking payments and ignoring drug traffickers. It was alleged that officers of Mr. Hugo Chávez's revolutionary Bolivarian movement that planned the 1992 Venezuelan coup d'etat attempts had created a group that participated in drug trafficking that was known as the Cartel Bolivariano, or Bolivarian Cartel. Following the 1992 coup attempts, the Venezuelan officers may have sought to take over the government, since there was money to be made from corruption, particularly in drugs. In 1993, the term Cartel of the Suns was first used when allegations of two National Guard generals of the Anti-Drug National Command, Mr. Ramon Guillen Davila and Mr. Orlando Hernandez Villegas, were investigated for drug trafficking crimes. The term came from the general emblems that looked like the suns on their uniforms. The Cartel of the Suns name returned in 2004 thanks to the reporter and city council member, Mr. Mauro Marcano. Shortly before he was murdered, Mr. Marcano alleged that Mr. Alexis Manero, head of the National Guard and the Dirección General de Inteligencia Militar, was involved in drug trafficking. The Venezuelan government under Mr. Hugo Chávez expanded corruption to unprecedented levels in an already corrupt military. Mr. Chávez gave military officials millions of dollars for social programs that allegedly disappeared, also giving legal immunity to drug trafficking officials to maintain power and loyalty. When Mr. Chávez ousted the United States Drug Enforcement Administration in 2005, Venezuela became a more attractive route for drug trade. According to Colombian intelligence, an arrested drug vigilante stated that senior figures in President Hugo Chávez's security forced them to arrange drug shipments through Venezuela. It's been alleged that the National Guard had worked with the FARC with drug trading. British officials alleged the planes from Colombia would also be sheltered by Venezuelan Air Force bases. Allegedly, lower-ranking National Guardsmen compete for positions at border checkpoints so they can be paid bribes for illicit trade, though a large portion of bribes go to their superiors, supposedly. The corrupt officials of the Cartel of the Sun trafficked drugs from Colombia to Venezuela where they are shipped internationally. President of Venezuela Nicolas Maduro has personally promoted individuals accused of drug trafficking to high positions of the Venezuelan government. In May 2018, he was said to have received drug trafficking profits from Mr. Diosdado Cabello, and in January 2015, the former security chief of both Mr. Hugo Chávez and Mr. Diosdado Cabello, Mr. Limzy Salazar, made accusations that Cabello was head of the Cartel of the Suns. Mr. Salazar was placed in witness protection, fleeing to the United States with assistance of the Drug Enforcement Administration's Special Operations Division. After cooperating with the administration and providing possible details on Cabello's involvement with the international drug trade, Mr. Salazar stated that he saw Mr. Cabello give orders on transporting tons of cocaine. The shipments of drugs were reportedly sent from the FARC in Colombia to the United States and Europe, with the possible assistance of Cuba. The alleged international drug operation had possibly involved other senior members of Venezuela's government as well, such as Mr. Tarek El Esemi and Mr. Jose David Cabello. Mr. Diosdado's brother, Mr. Hugo Carvajal, is allegedly one of the leaders of the Cartel of the Suns. On July 22, 2014, Mr. Hugo Carvajal, former head of the Venezuelan military intelligence, was detained in Aruba. Despite having been admitted on a diplomatic passport and being named Consul General to Aruba in January, the arrest was carried out following a formal request by the US government, which accuses Mr. Carvajal of ties to drug trafficking and to the FARC guerrilla group. On the 27th of July 2014, Mr. Carvajal was released after authorities decided that he had diplomatic immunity, but was also considered persona non grata, otherwise defined as an unacceptable or unwelcome person. On March of 2020, after a strategic $10 million bounty imposed on Mr. Hugo Carvajal and other Venezuelan narco-terrorists, he decided to surrender to the US, possibly to cut a deal with information on bigger supposedly corrupt government officials and narco-terrorists that are affiliated with Mr. Maduro's government, not to mention Mr. Maduro himself has a $15 million bounty. Mr. Yazenki Lamas, former pilot to First Lady Celia Flores, was extradited to the United States from Colombia, having allegedly provided air traffic codes to allow planes carrying cocaine to impersonate commercial flights. Venezuelan President Mr. Nicolas Maduro reportedly asked Colombian Defense Minister Mr. Luis Carlos Villegas Echeverri to reject the request for extradition. Mr. Lamas has been linked to hundreds of flights operated in Venezuela carrying drugs. Months later, on September 10, 2013, 31 suitcases filled with cocaine arrived at the Caracas Simón Bolívar International Airport of Maquita, Venezuela. The suitcases were brought in through a worker's entrance to avoid scanners and baggage checks. They had stickers with counterfeit barcodes and were accepted by the Air France luggage system despite not belonging to any travellers. The 31 suitcases containing 1.3 tons of cocaine, with a street value of €240 million, was placed on an Air France flight, astonishing the Charles de Gaulle airport authorities, as it was the largest seizure of cocaine recorded in mainland France. Reception of the cocaine in France was then had to be handled by one of France's biggest marijuana traffickers, the incarcerated Mr. Sofiane Hambli, according to the testimony of Hambli himself. However, unknown to Mr. Dawes and his Venezuelan partners, the operation was compromised. British undercover operatives in Venezuela had warned the French of an impending shipment using an Air France flight, and the French had set up controlled handover operations. According to sources familiar with the investigation, Mr. Hambli was a collaborator with a French police unit, the Central Office for the Suppression of Illicit Drug Trafficking. Police deliberately let some of the shipment through so they could follow a lorry load of drugs to the French-German border, where they arrested 5 people. The investigation eventually led to Mr. Dawes. The seizure made international headlines, and Venezuela came under pressure to respond. A government minister admitted that suitcases had gone through security scanners that had clearly shown the presence of drugs. Authorities initially made 27 arrests, including airport workers, low-ranking members of the GNB, which is responsible for security at Venezuela's airports, and Mr. Ernesto Mora Carvajal, the GNB lieutenant colonel, and Mr. Hugo Carvajal's nephew, who headed the airport security. 7 airport workers and 3 GNB officials later received sentences of between 10 and 22 years in prison. Mr. Mora Carvajal, however, was quickly declared innocent and released. On the 15th of February 2014, a commander for the Venezuelan National Guard was stopped while driving to Valencia with his family and was arrested for having 554 kilos of cocaine in his possession. On the 11th of November 2015, DEA agents arrested in Haiti 2 relatives of Miss Celia Flores, the then First Lady of Venezuela, while trying to move 800 kilograms of cocaine from Venezuela to the United States. There was little doubt that the true masterminds would be found much higher up, and in 2020 the US Department of Justice accused President Maduro, Mr. Hugo Carvajal, and Mr. Diosdado Cabello of involvement in the case. Among the evidence were communications and intercepts with Mr. Maduro and Mr. Carvajal, and Mr. Cabello shortly after the seizure said that they should not have used the Maquita airport for drug trafficking and should stick to established trafficking routes. Mr. Dawes himself was arrested at his large villa on the Costa del Sol in 2015 and extradited to France. He denied the charges, saying he had no involvement in the crime. The case exposed how the key to cocaine trafficking today is the extreme violence with which the trade has become synonymous. And it showed the cancerous effect of the cocaine trade, which corrupts states wherever it spreads, eroding capacity, and in the more extreme cases, democracy altogether. With trafficking to Europe booming, the cocaine trade is now spreading the cancer of corruption further and quicker than ever before, on both sides of the Atlantic. Drug traffickers have 2 main weapons at their disposal. Captured in Mr. Pablo Escobar's infamous offer to those who cooperation he sought, plomo o plata, silver or lead. Since Mr. Escobar's time, it is plomo that has been most connected to the cocaine trade, from the Medellin cartel blowing up airlines to Mexican cartels hanging bodies from bridges or tossing severed heads on the dance floors. Europe has not had to endure the same level of bloodshed as Latin America, but it too has seen extreme violence resulting from the cocaine trade. The cocaine trade is to blame for the rising gun crime in Britain. Our firearms cases and firearms seizures are 99% linked to the drugs war. Police sources in Spain paint a similar picture, blaming drug trade disputes for the bulk of the country's murders. Even the Netherlands, which has one of the lowest homicide rates in Europe, has seen a severed head left as a narco message, and innocent bystanders gunned down in drug war disputes. A family member and lawyer of a witness in a major cocaine trafficking case were murdered. The latest discovery in July 2020 was of an underworld prison with multiple cells and a torture room that was set up by a cocaine trafficking group. However, while today's drug traffickings remain more than willing to use extreme violence, they also understand that this is what has led to the downfall of many of their predecessors. Violence, particularly extreme violence, creates headlines and draws the attention of authorities. Instead, plata is the weapon of choice today for transnational organised crime. Corruption from drug trafficking penetrates the state at all levels, from police patrolmen to presidents, and it targets all branches of the state: the judicial, legislative, executive, and the security forces. It has to put justice up for sale in many Latin American countries, and seen police and military not only facilitate but participate in drug trafficking and even murder, and it has placed certain governments at the service of organised crime, at local and even national levels. Returning back to Mr. Dawes, he was secretly recorded bragging about his involvement in the shipping to a member of a Colombian drugs cartel during a meeting in Madrid hotel. He was arrested after being taped boasting, "You know the big one in Paris, in all the luggage, that was mine." Mr. Dawes was arrested in 2015 when officers swooped on his mansion in Benalmádena, a town in the Costa del Sol in Spain, where they found guns, cash and encrypted phones. Mr. Dawes was accused of buying large amounts of drugs from Italy's 'Ndrangheta mafia, which is thought to run much of Europe's cocaine trade from Calabria. He was extradited to France shortly after his arrest, and tried by 5 judges who ordered him and 4 accomplices to pay a £27 million fine. The Costa del Sol was known as a hideaway for British criminals in the past, especially in the late 1970s and 80s, when there were no extradition agreements with Britain. Guns, cash, and encrypted mobile phones were seized from the property, and he was extradited back to France to face trial. In his final statement at the Paris court hearing on Friday, Mr. Dawes said, "I continue to claim my innocence." Mr. Dawes had hoped to get the recording of him dismissed on legal grounds, but a document submitted by his defence team in support of that claim turned out to be a forgery. He told the court his claims in the video were just a made-up story, intended to provoke the police into arresting him so he could prove his innocence. In June 2008, another court was told that Mr. Dawes was one of 3 drug generals who had been at the head of a multi-million-pound empire in Nottinghamshire. Before the verdict, Mr. Dawes was laughing and smiling, even miming hanging himself to his lawyer as he entered the dock. But he was convicted of 8 charges: unauthorised importation of drugs by an organised gang, trafficking, smuggling and importation by an organised gang of prohibited products, unauthorised transport of narcotics drugs, unauthorised offer or sale of narcotic drugs, unauthorised acquisition of narcotic drugs, participation in a group committing criminal acts for the preparation of a crime, and participation in a group committing criminal acts for the preparation of an offence. He was acquitted of unauthorised possession of narcotic drugs. In July 2020, judges told him that he would have to serve at least 15 years of his 22-year sentence. Of 2 other Britons on trial, Mr. Nathan Wheat was convicted of 6 charges and jailed for 13 years, while Mr. Kane Price was acquitted. 3 Italians were also convicted. Finally, bringing Mr. Dawes to justice had been an international effort of numerous countries working hand in hand in investigations. It also had a dramatic impact in dismantling Mr. Dawes' criminal empire and protecting the public from the drugs and violence they dealt in. Mr. Dawes was suspected of being involved in the 2002 murder of a teacher in the Netherlands, money laundering in the United Arab Emirates and Switzerland, and dealings with Colombian drug cartels. Mr. Dawes is also believed to have shipped cocaine hidden inside commercial shipping containers, bringing furniture from China and fruit from South America, as well as heroin from Turkey and Afghanistan for delivery to the UK. He also used private boats and cars. Mr. Robert Dawes is to be extradited from a Paris jail where he is serving 22 years for cocaine smuggling to the Netherlands in connection with a murder 18 years ago. Now, the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Netherlands has confirmed that Mr. Dawes is regarded as a suspect in the murder of Gerard Meesters in 2002 in his home in Groningen, a city in the northern Netherlands. An extradition request was filed for Mr. Dawes from Paris to the Netherlands and granted in a court in Paris in August. 2 detectives have been investigating at home and abroad for the past 2 years. An interrogation of Mr. Robert Dawes was part of the investigation. It is believed that Gerard Meesters, an innocent schoolteacher, was shot in 2002 for refusing to reveal the whereabouts of his sister, who had disappeared after a shipment of cannabis went missing. If Mr. Dawes is prosecuted and convicted in the Netherlands for the murder of Gerard Meesters, the public prosecutor assumes that he must first serve his French sentence before going to the Netherlands to serve a Dutch sentence, but only if he is prosecuted and convicted. Mr. Dawes is also suspected of being the boss of the impenetrable international telecommunications network used by the Mexican drug lords, despite currently being held behind bars in France. Robert Dawes is the suspected mastermind behind the international encrypted network. The Nottingham-born trafficker stopped his associates mentioning his real name on phone calls, so many in the drug supply chain simply knew him as the Voice. Mr. Dawes, worth £50 million or more, supplies the likes of the mafia and Mexican drug cartels with the handsets fitted with encrypted SIM cards. If the BlackBerry handset falls into the wrong hands, the gang can simply send a kill code text which destroys anything stored on the device. The encryption technology, believed by the National Crime Agency to have been written by a Ukrainian tech genius, used to be supplied by a now dissolved UK registered company, Number 1 Business Communication. Usually organised criminals download encrypted phone apps or buy burner phones, but this is the first detailed case of a UK crime group controlling an entire network. These were major players in control of a phone network which could not be penetrated. Mr. Dawes has always been very switched on with his comms, but once he had control of his secret end-to-end encryption, it became more difficult. He would not deal with anyone on anything sensitive unless they were on this network. It was also the first time we had seen a whole organised crime group operating in a number of countries, including the UK, using the same network like this. Number 1 Business Communication was registered in the United Kingdom in 2011 by Mr. Roy Livings, an associate of Mr. Dawes, who was later jailed for importing 167 kilos of cocaine into Portugal. Another founding director, Israeli Mr. Elamir Gampel, was jailed for laundering €30 million of Colombian drug cartel money through a UK firm. To get around Mr. Dawes' impenetrable phone system, investigators resorted to an old-fashioned surveillance, bugging a hotel room in Madrid where he met with a Colombian cartel representative. The 49-year-old was arrested in his villa on the Costa del Sol in 2015, and investigators seized the encrypted phones. But by the time they examined them, the incriminating data had all been erased. Even behind bars, cops believe that Mr. Dawes is giving orders to his network through making calls on illicit mobile phones. The encrypted network is allowed to operate, as it's not easy to prove it's only being used by criminals. Authorities would have to find the servers to take down a network, but this would be extremely difficult since they're based in a number of countries. Number 1 Business Communication has been dissolved in the UK, but still has sales outlets in 24 countries. A shop in Manchester was the only place in the UK selling the encrypted phone and SIM package, costing £1,300 for a 6-month contract. There are people who argue it's their right to have encryption, but at this level we rarely find those kinds of comms are used for legitimate business reasons. This telecommunications network was favoured by the likes of El Chapo and many other drug lords all across the globe. The handsets are also used by the mafia and cartels, made infamous by caged Mexican crime boss Mr. Joaquin Guzman, nicknamed El Chapo. All users have an encrypted SIM card in an adapted BlackBerry handset. Dawes made it clear that his name should not be mentioned in phone calls, so associates referred to him as the Voice. Many in the drug supply chain never knew his real identity. Mr. Dawes worked closely with a Dutch crime group led by Mr. Gwente Martha, whose right-hand man, Mr. Nahib Baobao, was a director of Number 1 Business Communications Belgium Limited, However, Mr. Bao Bao and Mr. Martha were gunned down in 2012 and 2014 respectively. The gangland slaying sparked more than 20 tit-for-tat assassinations across Europe, including cases of mistaken identity. Tell us what you think about Mr. Dawes and his life, and what you think about encryption, and what levels the public should have access to in the comments down below.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.